Welcome to a new edition of the brand called You. Today, I have a very interesting personality who has been a professional manager and an entrepreneur. Suhas Misra, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Privileged to be here.
Thank you. Suhas is from IIM Calcutta. He started his career with Coca Cola and then he became an entrepreneur. Founded Channel Play, founded Hector Beverages, which has got an absolutely iconic brand called Paperboard. And I was disappointed to learn that he had sold it because I'm a great consumer of paperboard products. And then, he founded or joined the board of Khabar Leheria, Tardigrade Health Tech, Health Factorial. So we're going to talk a lot about on the show.
Sure.
So, Suhas, tell me a little bit about your early career, your learnings, some of your challenges.
So, I wanted to, as an MBA, student, you always are thinking of, am I a marketing person? And brands is something which I got interested in a lot during my time at IMCAL. Thought this is what I want to do. And for various reasons, I used to think it has this whole philosophical sort of underpinning, while also there's a lot of maths which goes into figuring it out. So I used to think it has the right sort of, checks all the boxes. So my focus was mostly to apply to all of these FMCG companies because that's how you think at that time. And the first door which opened up said, here's an office, was Coca-Cola. In fact, I often think of that day because in a counterfactual, because the ITC door might have opened later or Marico or whatever. And I wonder that if it was not Coca-Cola, would a few years later, and if it was, say, ITC, would have launched a cigarette brand later.
Correct.
And that's something which I have started thinking about a lot in my Hector days later. So that's how I got into Coca-Cola. Thought it's all headed to marketing, but again, a lot of people from that who have that arc realize that you basically spend time in distribution for a while. And I went into it grudgingly, but really enjoyed it. Started thinking I'm really good at this. Met Neeraj, with whom I later co-founded Hector. So there was a lot of learning around that space, and going in new to a space which has a lot of rules defined, because distribution has a history, has tradition, and so many, almost all major FMCG companies have similar, stories that come out of distribution. But started thinking that all this could be done much better. In fact, all sales I felt could be done more scientifically. And I had a brief stint after Coca-Cola at Nokia, and then in that while reconnected with my classmates from IMCAL and said, all of sales could be more scientific, and it's a big enough thing to try and do. So let's start a company, and that's how Channel Play happened.
And what was Channel Play about?
So our premise was that I'm sure you would have in your early career had something similar. So when you go in, and especially as a management trainee, and you end up then, say, as an area sales manager or something, and then you have a lot of people who are reporting to you, who are much older, who are through the system, who are always thinking of you as, what does this kid know? And but as the kid in that side of the story, you want to say, listen, I know.
What do you know?
What do you know? So it's that jostling of, where, and in that I started thinking a lot about how a lot of these things which are just assumed to be, requiring some skill, almost like an artist, like a good salesperson was seen either as an artist or a craftsperson, was not seen as, there was no science of it all. And but if you look at a larger arc of how different categories have evolved, and through case studies, etc., which you become familiar with. If a burger can be standardized, if making fries can be standardized, assembly line earlier, like all those iconic stories, you think sales, why can't the process of selling be standardized? So it starts seeming like an intellectually compelling question. And I think a lot of people go through that phase. I've met people who now are, say, at that stage. And that conflict is quite, it goes on. And And so the thinking was that with enough training and measurement and building that ecosystem, we will convert all sales into science. So the company's tagline was the science of selling. Opportunistically, and because like it was very early days for Indian entrepreneurship. It wasn't what it is now. Like people were very surprised back in 2006-7 that why you're quitting a regular job and like a good job people can look up to, want, etc. But it was hard, like the classic early struggle, like running out of money. We didn't have much savings. It was just 3-4 years after campus. So we ended up doing a lot of businesses in different directions. Till this whole thesis emerged, and the company essentially became a retail marketing company. Arguably India's largest retail marketing company now, run by this friend of mine with whom I started. He's still running it, Sandeep, and does a lot of work for a lot of high involvement brands categories like say Apple and Nokia and Nokia, so Samsung, etc. And so that is the arc it has taken since. So the early idea was more about science of selling, but within that it became about retail marketing. Planogram still has a lot of components of how do you track displays, etc. through tech. So
very interesting. So let's move to the next part, which is paperboard. What was the logic behind creating that? I mean, what attracted me was flavors that I had grown up with.
Yes.
But what was your logic?
So, Hector, we again went through the trials and tribulations of early challenges before we cracked the story with paperboard.
Yeah.
But the idea, if you think about it, it's not the. I mean, it was waiting to happen, right? In hindsight, like so many in our generation grew up with Ampana.
Yeah.
So many in our generation wanted to introduce it to their kids. But the systems which brought Ampana to our refrigerator as kids, which were typically involved a grandmother or like things like that, and you come back after playing cricket in the afternoon, summer vacation, and everyone says have some Ampana, like depending on where you grew up. And it was waiting to happen, and it's in large part that it hadn't happened is I feel. So a lot of people, investors, etc., used to ask us that, if it is such a big opportunity, why would Coke or Pepsi not do it? And it sounds like an intuitively perfect question, but that's the thing about large organizations and how they work and how they can't, and it's not as if those companies did not know of the category, right? So during my time at Coke and even at Pepsi, friends who worked there, every year in that summer management trainee cycle, there would be someone given this, you work on something for indigenous beverages. But it always was that. It was like someone putting together something and saying, here. So it was an idea waiting to happen. We also had the very, again, view of that Neeraj and I thought that we really want to work together, and we said, what should we work on? And then after some time we said, we were really good at beverages, let's work on beverages. And then the simple question was, what next? Paperboard wasn't our first iteration in terms of answering that question. But I mean, if someone looks, I in hindsight also think that is a brand which or a category which should have happened already, but fortunately it hadn't. And
I agree.
So
So you took on the big names.
Yes.
The Coke. Your former company, your Pepsis, and there are so many other big names in this area. What is it that you did differently? Because once after you had conceived the product, it became a distribution game.
I think on the distribution side of things, what we did well was the one thing that as the startup you have to do well in that archetypical battle between small and big, is that we worked very hard on point of sale execution. So that's the most boring part of that story, because a large part of that story is about the stories we told, and they were very authentic. And a lot of the early stories were in fact my stories. Like I was just writing my childhood and it was fun. also sometimes cathartic, but it was fun for the most part.
Yeah.
And but I think there was a lot of hard work that went into fighting for visibility at that point of sale, because ours, like this is almost, I mean, it's slightly before WhatsApp, the early days. I mean, at least WhatsApp wasn't big. So all of this used to happen on mails, but we used to, across India, like, from all major cities, have this day-long competition going of who has put up the best bunting, who climbed on which tree to get what angle for a dangler or whatever. So like we were working very hard. Like all our distribution trucks had a ladder, for example, and the person who, like that almost often joyless role of going shop to shop and taking an order, or even with ready stock.
Yeah.
That person's life is usually like that person being inspired was a part of the story which doesn't often come up, because, and for good reason, because essentially as consumers, we all know people buy the story as much as, like the product, and there was a compelling story happening. And that takes up most of the mind space. But I think the hard work of saying we will get this brand to talk in a very competitive space, because it's not like we were going to markets which were not competitive. So you're fighting for space in, say, Bandra or in Koramangala, and like these are markets where everyone is trying to get in. So the hard work of it is something which I thought was quite amazing. I feel, and a lot of people in FMCG used to say at that time, that you guys are doing the best execution in terms of, we at times felt we are going overboard. Like, how much money are we putting behind each shop? Like how many danglers, how many posters? But we did go for it, and I think that was
amazing.
Yeah.
But what I to taking up from what you've just said, you focused on the last mile connectivity, if I can use the telecom term, which is the guy who was your final distributor taking orders with the retailer.
Right.
And I remember I used to do the same thing in Guardian.
Right.
Where I used to always tell people that the best training has to be given to the guy who is at the counter.
Yes.
Because
absolutely,
he or she is the person who gives you the customer the experience.
Correct.
And I'm actually surprised when something as simple as what you and I are talking is not addressed by all these gurus and the big companies.
Yeah, I think I used to find that fascinating. So, coming back to that question which investors used to ask us, that why would they not do it? One was the strategic reason at the top, that if you're working in a company like Coke and you are, say, the hotshot manager for, say, marketing or anything, you would want to be on top of the carbonated budget, on top of the cola budget, say now the Sprite budget or whatever. The other reason is at the other end, like that guy's inspiration. So in that hot summer day, we've all done like route riding or whatever. This person gets off, say, at a shop in Lajpat Nagar, it's 40 plus degrees. He knows that this shop will buy as much thumbs up as he can give. So it is an incentive, because he's incentivized per case. It is an incentive to load as much thumbs up as possible on the truck. At the other, but this guy then has, and it's true of any brand. I'm just taking an example. Like you have a product which is very easy to sell at the last mile. And how do you get that person inspired enough or incentivized enough to work on this other important, right now small but future big thing? Is a big challenge. So that person's sort of, like you said, the psychological sort of, or rather how that person is interacting with company strategy is, I think, often overlooked, simply because I feel that often one forgets that there is a lot happening there. Like these are the people who become spreadsheet numbers, and you don't get to know their stories. And I think it's also related to, in India in general, us not having as much of an ethnographical view of things, like not finding out stories of. So I'm sure in your areas you would have known a lot of these people. Like you would have gotten to, this person must have told you, I've bought a house. And when you start putting them in context, then it becomes.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So you exited from paperboard, and then for 2 years, in your own words, you walked the earth.
Yes.
What were you doing, and what were your learnings?
Walk the earth does sound pretentious and would like that, but walk the earth is I mean, I was basically, I said I'll not do anything.
Okay.
I'll think what I want to do. So I did the regular traveling here, traveling there, living for a few weeks in this city, that country, whatever. But mostly I was traveling and reading a lot, meeting people whom I would have otherwise not met, because working on one thing very intensively, your sort of social circle becomes similar. Like everyone's doing something relatable to what you're doing. It was a period of, I think, in which I met a lot of people whom I wouldn't have met otherwise. It was also a period of saying, like, how do I figure out what to do in terms of
Next.
what, yeah, and
Yeah.
instead of, like a continuum of Coca-Cola recruited me back in the day, I learned about beverages, later on started Hector Beverages. Started seeming like, as an entrepreneur, you feel you are exercising a lot of free choice, free will. Started seeming it's not really that. It's all followed from one event there. So I want to break that cycle.
Correct.
So I had some random ideas in that period, saying I'll do an MPhil in evolutionary anthropology. But Oxford and Cambridge didn't give me admission. I applied to do those two places.
That is really, really different, huh? From what
It is
you've been
different,
doing, yeah.
yes. So I thought, yeah, this is a 1-year thing. I'll do something and think, but it didn't happen. So also, I think the idea of applying was more important to me than actually doing it. So there was that,
Okay.
and in that period also there was a lot of thinking around, what are the really big things one could do. Which always is tricky. Like, is there something which is bigger than the other? But there was that phase also. That's when I got it connected to the Khabar area folk. So
I'm going to come to Khabar area a little later, but
Yes.
you then founded, you got into health with tardigrade, health tech, and health factorial. What do these
So
ventures do?
Tardigrade is that was my coming out of that phase company. Broad idea was that, the ironical data point there is that in 2017, so the Geo and Airtel response was already happening. So towers coming up, and it was very clear that access to smartphone and possibly good internet is already beating access to healthcare. And that's too much of an irony to not do anything about. So I thought that, okay, the earlier promise of telemedicine hasn't been fulfilled because connectivity issues. And if you when I researched it, I figured that all the early version of telemedicine companies were essentially solving tech problems. So their problem was they were not core tech companies solving tech problems, like saying how do you do data transfer,
Sure.
whatever kbps, etc.
Sure.
So I felt that can change now because this is more accessible. So we mobilized. I built a strong tech team, and we were working with some people from public health, etc. Created a system which connected villages, around eventually 35 villages in rural UP, to Lucknow city doctors, specialists, pharma, pathology, with one interlocutor at that village whose house. So that was typically a woman. Because one, there is an access question around gender in healthcare, but also because a lot of women who earlier worked on vaccination programs, which have run their remit, were doing odd jobs now. So I thought that woman's house with her smartphone can act like a last mile clinic thing.
Correct.
So did that. There were a lot of consultations. No unit economics happened. The classic Jhula Chap doctor has a lot of provenance there. Started respecting that institution much more. Initially, you go in not dissimilar to, like with the white man's burden, saying I'll fix this and change this. But then you realize that this person, almost in a poor economics kind of sense, so has now Nobel Prize. So but this person is organic, has survived in that, sitting there,
Very true.
is not as evil, caricaturish villain as often you think from the outside, because you get the worst stories from there. You get amputation done with non-needed, etc. That's horrible. But for the most part, that institution is what is keeping healthcare going in a lot of ways in India, because India doesn't do public health.
And what about health factorial?
So tardigrade, we had a lot of, we were burning a lot of money. The business model was, unit economics were not really emerging. because people would come for consultations, wouldn't buy anything. So then we said, okay, sad but can't keep running the operational layer. Cut it as an AI chatbot. This was still part of tardigrade. But then started thinking that if one has to build a business in healthcare rather than solve the problem, because I realized I'm not the not-for-profit person. I've engaged with that world actively, but that's not my thing. So thought that if a business has to be built in healthcare, it will be more along the lines of sums of verticals, like especially in a tech context. Like while a lot of tech plays, even ours, but a lot of the existing health tech businesses look at it as a horizontal. So they try to say we are a platform, you plug in, I make the connection, and there's value. We started thinking that there is value in the verticalization of it if a business has to be built. Then like growing up, one had all those, if you wherever you go on your regular train journey as a kid, you remember like Burlington Sex Clinic, all wall paintings one after the other. That's how they market, and that gets, so that space still exists quite like that. So I thought contemporizing that is
so it was more for sexual health.
Yes.
Okay.
So Health Factorial is envisioned as a sum of verticals in healthcare, but Misters.in, our first brand, is a brand targeted at men's sexual health and wellness. Actually, it's targeted men's health and wellness, but sexual health is a big component.
So tell me, in the land of Kama Sutra, and obviously you must have done a lot of research.
Yes.
Not on Kama Sutra.
I read the Kama Sutra recently when I started this business. So yeah.
Why is sex still such a major taboo? Is it just a middle class morality?
I think there's obviously that narrative that in between, through say a Victorian sensibility, there's that angle of the story that India's prudishness is more recently acquired. But that said, I feel it's a larger problem that somehow not just that got acquired, like a lot of basically I think it goes down to a patriarchal problem again. So the idea of man somehow has sort of grown in one direction, like it has not gotten as fleshed out as one would assume, or as even not just Kama Sutra, but like so many. I was reading so the Sanskrit version of Shakuntala is more explicit than any Hindi version that one can find, or English version. So I only know that it is more explicit, but because I can't read Sanskrit fluently, I don't know, and I can't find a Hindi text which hasn't left those bits out. Correct. So there are lots of these cases across all our major, all Indian literature, and I think one is like obviously there is a politics and who comes in and interaction between cultures, and so this is what it is. But I think second, modern India has somehow managed to find a way to there's not enough rebellion around it.
Correct.
And this is like a larger cultural thing. I don't want to do anything about that, but I feel that that rebellion in India is like intergenerational rebellion. So if you think of forces that say this is our tradition and so respected, and forces that say let's define new rules or let's break all rules. So the resolution of that classic intergenerational conflict in India often is that I will do a mystical reconciliation. It is not, we haven't had the rebel generation. So I feel that intergenerationally, for whatever reason, and that should be examined, I feel overall culturally India does not have intergenerational rebellion.
I understand.
Which may be a good and bad thing, I don't know. So,
I agree. So I've got time for two more questions.
Yes, please.
Number one is, I want to hear about Khabar Lahariya.
Yes. That's I like to talk about.
Yeah.
So Khabar Lahariya, I fortunately, like in that time when I was not doing much and working, that was one thing I got involved in. It was a newspaper that emerged from a women's literacy movement in 2000 or early part of that decade, and as part of a larger social ecosystem built by 3 or 4 amazing women who had come back at that time after studying in the US, wanted to fight the good fight in India, change things, etc. And from women's literacy, because that had sort of achieved its goal, they said, now that we know how to read and write, there should be something to read.
Yeah.
So news from a women's point of view, and later on became a story of so it has only underprivileged female reporters in Bundelkhand, and that amazed me because I'm familiar with Bundelkhand. My mother is from Jhansi, and for an all women newspaper running there, like it's one of the more even high levels of patriarchy elsewhere, but Bundelkhand like tops it, right? It's one of the up there areas. So women doing that fascinated me. So I said that, like obviously there's some money I can give, but more than that, I'm available like for something if you. So I got involved, spent some time there, spent a lot of time. They have a central office in Delhi, and we working with those people. We went from print to digital, which sounds sad. Like everyone there was sad that print is ending, but it now has like 6-7 million views a month.
Wow.
So and of that kind of audience, which like is so and is a company now, and the Cavalleria got this Google News Initiative award. Like they wanted to award companies which are working on the future of journalism. So it was one of the 2 companies which got that last year. So it's done some great things, and there's a 5 to 10 million views story every month.
Fantastic.
So it's great, and it's all these women who are running it, and they have all like made that switch so magnificently, like with their smartphones doing this reporting. There's a lot of proper journalism training that they go through. My role there is now more limited. Earlier I was more involved in before I started the company again, Health Factorial. So it is I think it is the future of news because it's very unlikely storytellers. Journalism essentially is storytelling, obviously real stories, but the voice is so different. Like if you read it, it tells you that. I mean, for me, it is always that the whole what matters thing, and how almost mutually exclusive the sets are becoming in terms of bottom up reporting versus if you are unfortunately tuned into a TV news debate.
Correct.
It's different. It's just not. It doesn't feel like the same world. And for that, I think it's an important medium for a lot of people to just follow. And I think now it has life of its own as a company. So it's a thing.
Wonderful. So my last question to you, and that is relating to, you've done so many startups, and you're continuing to be involved, and you're excited about everything you do.
Yeah.
You also said you had failures. What have been some of your learnings from your failures?
Well, one is very specific, and like you should. I keep thinking this, and this has been learnt a few times, so it should not be repeated by me, but I have repeated it also. Is that as an entrepreneur, have a disruption thesis rather than a creation of a category thesis.
Correct.
So very often entrepreneurs get conflated with creators, and so for me, rural healthcare as an entrepreneur was overreach. It was philosophically very satisfying, learnt a lot, but it was as an entrepreneur overreach. You are trying to solve a problem that so many people have not been able to solve, and just because now there is, I feel that kind of changing the story from disrupting something big. That's the, but this is a very specific kind of learning.
Okay.
The second is and that's like more in that know thyself category, that I realize that certain things excite me, and so I should do that. There's no other way I can figure out. So what makes sense makes sense.
Correct.
So know thyself is important. Like interrogation of self, I think but that can hardly be called a learning. But just suggestion is that everyone should spend time on it.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Suhas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok.
Talking to you has been absolutely fantastic.
It was
Good
lovely.
luck
Yes.
with all the ventures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You podcast. Be sure to visit tbcy.in to join the conversation, access show notes, and discover fantastic bonus content. You can follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Simply search for The Brand Called You. Thank you and see you next week.